Kenzie Lalonde with you alongside Arpon Basu at Laval-sur-le-Lac. Montreal Canadiens annual golf tournament here today, and it is very much the kickoff for the upcoming NHL season. Arpon, we heard from management today of the Montreal Canadiens. We heard from players. And a big conversation piece is using the term playoffs and being in the mix and what that looks like and the expectations upon management and then for the players to execute that. So to be here a few years into this rebuild and have that conversation of being in the mix here for a potential playoff spot, do you think they are where they should be in terms of having this conversation?
Well, what I find interesting is that actually, in the mix means in the mix for the playoffs. Yet no one wanted to say playoffs, right? So in the mix was the corporate communication message that they clearly all agreed upon beforehand. Jeff Molson just repeated ad nauseum that we're 3 years into a rebuild. Yeah. It's a process. We're patient, this and that. So the messaging is really clearly don't get the expectations too high, but there are high expectations. This has been a bottom five team for 3 years in a row now. They haven't made the playoffs in 4 years. It's really something that they want to move away from. And so while no one is willing to say we want to be a playoff team this year, in the mix is a way to kind of fudge it. Let's be competitive, I think is the word that they should really have been using. Like, we want to be a more competitive team, and I think they have everything in place to do that. Now, do they have everything in place to be a playoff team? Probably not, but being in the mix is a reasonable goal. It's just, I found it funny, the distinction between being in the mix, which was heard about 20,000 times today, and playoffs, which was heard just about zero.
It's funny how they lean on these terms. A few years ago it was retooling, not rebuilding, retooling. Yeah, right. And now we're using the term in the mix.
Marc Bergevin had the reset.
The reset,
yeah, back
okay.
in the day, yeah.
There's always fun terms to describe all of this.
Right.
But we do look at where the Montreal Canadiens stand here at their roster. Bringing in someone like Patrik Laine, loosening up some room on the blue line to see a next development of some of these young defenders, Logan Mailloux, Laine Hutson, and where they stand. You do look at some of these, though limited, off-season changes, significant ones. Is it enough to make them at least get a step ahead here and be more competitive?
For sure. I think they are. It's just that they all come attached with questions. I think the one thing that's pretty sure is that the step that we saw Nick Suzuki take last season, I could safely predict that he's going to take another step. I think that really helped his confidence as a player. He knows where he stands in the NHL now. So I think but will Cole Caulfield reach a 40-goal standard? Will Patrik Laine find his 40-goal score standard? Can Kirby Dach produce the way he did in training camp last year, or can he look the way he did in training camp last year after a full year away? And he's such a critical piece to everything the Canadiens are trying to do. Like, if he can't figure that out, and if he can't pick up where he left off, then there's a massive hole at center on this team. And there's just a litany of questions. So, yes, can they be in the mix? Can they be in the playoffs? Sure. But, they need to be able to have positive bounces on all the questions that we have about this team, special teams, the young defense, giving up so many goals, giving up all the chances they give. They all need to fall in their favor, and that's just not reality. Every team has some that go their way, some that don't, and the Canadiens need a lot more of those questions to bounce their way in order to be in the playoff mix.
We heard from Nick Suzuki today, talk about that frustration and feeling as though people count out the Montreal Canadiens. But you look at wanting to take that step ahead, and in particular diving into maybe this top six. If it does remain Nick Suzuki, Cole Caulfield, Juraj Slafkovsky for a potential line, we look at line number 2. And could be Patrik Laine, Alex Newhook, Kirby Dach. Kirby Dach saying today, the preference is certainly to play at center. That is where he's most comfortable, but he will play wherever he needs to. So we see some depth here on the offensive side. Nick Suzuki made it clear he's pleased with what he's seeing there, but still the blue line will be quite young again and is significant. And you look at the minutes someone like Mike Matheson plays and Caden Gooley, who is still so young. This blue line is still quite green.
100%, absolutely, and it's going to continue to be green for a little while here. They don't really have room for all their young defensemen, and so that's going to be an issue of how they manage that. And Jeff Gorton said today, if some guys have to go to the minors, they have to go to the minors. And so you look at people who are still waiver eligible. So like Justin Barron has a big help because he's going to need waivers to go down. Arbor Jackai, I believe, at some point this season will need waivers to go down. So then you look at a guy like Jaden Struble, obviously Laine Hutson, David Reinbacher, Logan Mailloux. None of these guys need waivers to go down. And it could be a situation where we see guys going back and forth and it real become a meritocracy, but it's going to be a young blue line. Don't forget, David Savard is entering the final year of his contract. He's had trade rumors following him around for a year or so now. They will continue, obviously, being an unrestricted free agent. But one thing that Kent Hughes said today that I found interesting is that if things go the way they hope, he is hoping to arrive at the trade deadline and not necessarily be a buyer, but not necessarily be a seller. And, he has David Savard, he has Christian Dvorak, there's a couple of other guys whose contracts are expiring. If they're playing well enough that to justify it, the Canadiens might hang on to those guys and not need to go out and collect assets for them because, as Hughes mentioned, they're out of the asset acquisition phase and they're into a more targeted team-building phase of the rebuild. So if the Canadiens actually meet those expectations of being in the mix, you could see the Canadiens behave much differently at the trade deadline. Something Nick Suzuki said he's frankly sick of is being a seller at the deadline.
And kind of a last question here too, and taking a step ahead and wanting to do that, I think as well, you look at where they land right now in the season and in their makeup of this team and how far they still do need to go to make it possible, and what that can bring when someone like Josh Anderson comes back into the mix, who was very disappointed with his own personal season from last year and how he blends into this season. I think as well, you look on the blue line here for the Montreal Canadiens and how Kaiden Guhle can take another step here and being an elite defender. Like, could he be one of the top 10 NHL defenders this upcoming year? He plays a lot of minutes and he continues to play on that right side where he is always more comfortable on the left side. He continues to be such a versatile defender. Could this be the season where we are continuing to see his next steps here?
Yeah, I mean, in Guhle's case, for sure, you can see that happening. I mean, There's nothing to suggest it won't. I mean, if he could stay healthy, which has been a bit of an issue over his career, and the right side thing, which I hate. I think if the Canadiens were really more forward thinking or more thinking about the future, they would find a way to put Guhle on the left side. But it's a real confusing puzzle in the sense that, if you want Laine Hutson to play on this team, which I really think he should start the season in Montreal just to see how it looks. That's a spot on the left side. You already have Mike Matheson on that side. Like, if you put Kaiden Guhle on the left, Arbor Xhekaj's there, it just becomes a very crowded mess. So, I mean, I think Guhle is going to have to play on the right. I think he did fine there. But, yeah, can he take that next step? You mentioned Josh Anderson. One thing I thought was interesting, I was talking to some of the guys in rookie camp, and a lot of them, or a bunch of them, were in Brossard basically all summer. I mean, like Riley Kidney was there for like all of June and all of August. Sean Farrell, all of July and August. And there were a bunch of guys from Laval, Xavier Simoneau and William Trudeau, a lot of the local guys. But one guy who spent most of his summer in Montreal working with Adam Nicholas and Brossard was Josh Anderson, who is a multi-million-dollar player, has a contract in hand. There's no one's forcing him to be there, but it just shows you the extent to which his performance last season bothered him. And I think a lot of people are writing Josh off a little too quickly. Yes, he had a disastrous season last year, but I mean, it just seemed to be one of those things where he had bad luck at the start, and then it just snowballed and spiraled, and it got in his head, and he was never able to get out of it. But he has been a remarkably consistent scorer over his career. You can basically count on 20 to 25 goals from him every year. And based on what I heard about how he approached the summer and how he was working with, frankly, a bunch of kids, very few NHL guys were in those skates. David Savard was there, popped in and out. Nick Suzuki popped in and out. Josh Anderson was apparently there every day. So I think when you go back to the earlier point about what are some of the things that need to go right for them to make the playoffs, like if Josh Anderson finds his game and you have him on a third line as a 20, 25 goal scorer with his power and speed and physicality, that could be potentially be a game changer for this team. There's not many third line players when Josh Anderson's at his best who can play like Josh Anderson. So that's another one of those factors that kind of need to fall for the Canadiens to reach their goal.
And it doesn't surprise me either to see Josh Anderson stick around here and do something different, because that was a big takeaway from his post-game presser at the end of last season. He was going to evaluate everything this summer, how he was training, what he was eating, how he was watching film. Everything was going under the microscope. So to see something unique like that staying in Montreal doesn't really surprise me. I guess my last question here for you, I lied, we have one more, is in a way these Canadiens, they're not starting from day one here. Martin St. Louis has been here for a few years. There aren't too many lineup changes either. Do you think having a foundational understanding, structures, how this team operates behind the scenes will be another edge for them to be more competitive this season?
Well, for sure. And when you combine that with the fact that their youth has been here throughout Marty's time as coach, so, Cole Caulfield, Nick Suzuki, even Kirby Dach, even though he missed the season last year, was in coaches' meetings, was planning for games. He was pre-game meetings. He had to show up way early on game days to kind of take part in those meetings. So there's a lot of sort of institutional knowledge that has been sort of embedded and ingrained in these guys at a pretty young age still. So yeah, for sure, that's going to help, and that's going to help incorporate a guy like Patrick Laine and allow him to sort of seamlessly jump on this train. So that's an advantage for them. And yeah, and I think there's room for growth in Marty as well, you know, because this is a different team than he's had. Like he's really coached the team based on their talent level over the last couple of years, which wasn't high. So there were certain decisions that he just couldn't make because they weren't good enough for him to make them. I think now, like you look at the addition, you know, you mentioned like minor changes. Yeah, like Patrick Laine is obviously a big one, but there wasn't much else in terms of changes. But just the addition of Patrick Laine and a healthy Kirby Dach pushes a guy like Josh Anderson down or Brendan Gallagher into a third line role, and you know, having a Yoel Armia who had a resurgence last year in that bottom six mix. Like it's a very deep team up front all of a sudden, and I think they're really going to lean into that as being their primary advantage and try to win those matchups further down the lineup, because they have players that perhaps some of the other teams that they're going to face regularly, they don't have those types of players. A lot of expensive veteran players who have performed in the past playing on their bottom two lines, and they can probably dig in on that and gain an advantage there.
Just day one, Arpon. We're going to have to keep this chat going. We'll have to do a holiday check-in.
Yes, absolutely. We'll do a Halloween one.
Yeah, we'll do some theme conversation segments. Exciting, though. Day one here for the Montreal Canadiens as they kickstart a brand new season. Martin St. Louis, Nick Suzuki looking to make a significant jump this upcoming season.